With me now, Ward Elcock, former director of CSIS, Canada's spy agency, or the Canadian Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and Richard Fadden, former national security advisor to Prime Ministers Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. He's also a former CSIS director. Hello to both of you. Thank you very much for making the time. Let's start off on the big political question today the Prime Minister was on the receiving end of, and that is to have an inquiry or not. I think from my reading over the weekend, I've ascertained that you have differing opinions. So, Mr. Fadden, I'll start with you. Why should there be an inquiry from your perspective?
Well, I think to start with, this is an issue of transcending importance to Canadian democracy, and I think we need something that will be as open as possible and as objective as possible. I understand there's a parliamentary committee looking at this right now, but I think it's actually unfair to ask MPs who are, by definition, partisan to look at this issue totally objectively and without, giving the opportunity for overly partisan debates. One of the issues, I think, is that it is a bit more difficult to give public inquiries access to highly classified material, but there are precedents for doing it. You clear the commissioner and his staff, and you let them look at the material, and they can't report on it, but they can assure the readers in the final report that the matter has been dealt with. And in fact, it's not very different from what happens in House of Commons committee, although the committee dealing with national security, the Committee of Parliamentarians dealing with national security does have access.
Mr. Elcock, your view from what I've read, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, is that it might not be the best avenue to look into the issue.
I don't think it is the best avenue, actually. I think there are a couple of problems. One is I'm not sure that commissions of inquiry are as useful as many Canadians think they are. They're also very expensive. As well, I'm not sure that at the end of the day it will provide much assurance for Canadians that the issues have been examined. Yes, people will get access to the information, but at the end of the day, Canadians are going to have to go on trust that the Commission got its facts right. I think much more intelligent would be to give it to the Committee of Parliamentarians, which, while it is a partisan committee made up of partisan members of Parliament, has a more at arm's length from the cut and thrust of politics like a normal parliamentary committee, which I don't think would be a good place to do this. And so that would be, I think, the Committee of Parliamentarians would be the right place to send this.
So just to follow up, you'd say like a special committee designated just to do this?
No, there is a committee. The NSI-COP is the committee that is established to do this. I think some people are concerned that perhaps not all the details would come out, but I think the reality is if members of the various parties sitting on that committee come to a conclusion, I think the essentials will get out probably more than would in fact come out with a Royal Commission.
Let me take two steps back, and though you might disagree on the avenues, my guess is you agree on the substance of what needs to be examined. What do you think is at stake here, Mr. Fadden?
Well, I think what is at stake is the confidence of Canadians and the integrity of our political system, of our electoral system. And for that to be able to be worked on appropriately, we're going to need an organization that has the time and the resources to go from the very beginning, to look at the Canadian electoral system, to look at what CSIS does, to look at what people in government do with what CSIS does. And I would argue that with respect to what Ward has said, I think the Rouleau Commission, which is just wrapped up, is a perfect example of what can be done if you get the right commissioner in the right time frame. I think pretty well everybody agrees that that was an excellent example of what public inquiries can do, and that's the sort of thing that I'm advocating.
What do you think about that, Mr. Elcock?
I think, like Dick, that Mr. Justice Rouleau did a great job. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of Royal Commissions in my time in PCO who didn't do a great job, and it's not clear to me that this one necessarily would work that well. I think it would be better to send it to the Committee of Parliamentarians rather than a Royal Commission. But I think that the key thing is actually that the perception is that the government hasn't done anything with information that appears to be there. I think the government has got to find a way to take some kind of action that in fact would demonstrate that it is using the information available to take action to deal with these issues rather than simply letting it drift. And that's really the problem here.
And what is an example of that kind of action that they could take?
Well, there are a number of things. There are a range of things depending on what information they actually have, but they may actually be able to declare a diplomat persona non grata because of the activities they've been carrying on. It's also possible that there are people who could be prosecuted. That's more difficult because it depends on the information you have, how the government got that information, and whether you can in fact reveal the sources of that information to have a successful prosecution. But there are things the government could do or ought to be thinking of doing, and I'm a little surprised they haven't actually found something to do.
It's a good point, Mr. Fadden, because I too was sort of surprised to listen to the Prime Minister today essentially double down on what he said late last week, despite the kind of mounting calls for something more, or perhaps for the federal government to take a deeper look at its options or what exactly is transpiring. The Prime Minister essentially said the same thing. We've got a committee. We had other committees that produced reports. But I'm wondering, from the perspective of Canadians who are watching, what's still missing for them? What's still missing for you, Mr. Fadden?
Well, I agree with Ward that we need some government action, and I think some of the action is going to be legislative in nature. I would argue that it is a good practice to keep government out of elections. So I think we should amend the Canada Elections Act to clearly and unambiguously impose duties on political parties to take care about how foreign interference might occur at the constituency level, give the chief electoral officer and the commissioner of elections the power to monitor this. Just one example. I don't think this needs a royal commission. It doesn't need the committee of parliamentarians to look at it. I think we have to remember that this is not happening only in Canada. And, our tendency in this country is to look at things, I think, for too long. I'd amend the Canada Elections Act and impose a positive duty on political parties to monitor for foreign interference and to impose severe penalties if they don't do it.
And with specific reference to China, Mr. Elcock, the ask has been out there now for a while through a private member's bill, as well as the precedent in Australia about setting up, for example, a foreign agent registry. Is that something that the government could do?
I think that's also something the government could do, although that's slightly different than what Dick is, and I would agree with Dick that that's something that should be changed. But the reality is the only limitation with both of those suggestions is that it doesn't deal with the clandestine interference in Canadian politics or in the Canadian system or with Canadians. Those issues would still have to be dealt with in other ways.
And speaking of those issues, Mr. Fadden, I did want to get your perspective on the new allegations. Part of the reason why there's kind of additional questions for the Prime Minister over the weekend about a Liberal MP in Ontario, Han Dung. Global News reported that there were suspicions that CSIS had about his own involvement. He is denying that, I should say categorically, but his own involvement in this foreign interference. And the question was put to the Prime Minister, did CSIS warn you? Did anyone warn you about this and ask you not to put forth his or approve his nomination? He did not specifically address that question, just sort of said, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm standing with Mr. Dong, and also it's not the place of security officials to advise me of that kind of thing. In your experience, is that something CSIS would do, offer a warning to the Prime Minister?
Absolutely not. CSIS is quite restricted in what it can do, and basically it collects information, analyzes it, and makes it available to government departments and to ministers. I find it almost inconceivable that CSIS would, on a political issue like this, presume to tell the Prime Minister what to do or not to do with a candidate. What government departments or PMO or ministers' offices do with the information produced by CSIS is an entirely different issue. But I think on this one, the Prime Minister is entirely correct. It's not for CSIS to advise him on what to do with Liberal Party candidates.
Mr. Elcock, you worked in PCO. Would that information have come to the PCO and then maybe perhaps to the Prime Minister? Like, how does that process work?
There have been, I was the General Counsel in PCO for about 10 years. On occasion, I have received information from a variety of agencies to provide ultimately to the Prime Minister. But Dick is absolutely right. None of those agencies would provide advice to the Prime Minister. It would simply be information that was received and then was conveyed to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister would then have to make a decision on that information. Okay,
I'm going to leave it there. Mr. Elcock, Mr. Fadden, thank you very much for your time and for your insights this evening.
Good to be with you.